start again. All right. Hi, everyone. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you an activity from the Metabolic Disease high school curriculum. And this activity is the Food Additive Matching Game, which comes from Unit 1, which focuses on food production. So before we get into the activity itself, I want to share with you that every high school lesson that we've developed across all of the disease modules has a detailed lesson plan available for teachers. So here I've just shown the first page of the lesson plan for the activity from which I got the food additive matching game that we're going to be discussing today. And as you can see, it outlines lesson objectives as well as the lesson plan itself, which I'm going to talk to you about a little bit more in detail on the next slide. So like I said, the food additive matching game comes from the high school unit 1 from the metabolic disease curriculum. And for this particular lesson, the objectives are for students to be able to identify different types of food additives, to describe the uses of pesticides, GMOs, antibiotics, and hormones in food production, and finally, to use evidence to argue the pros and cons of food additives. And in terms of the lesson plan, we've provided kind of a minute-by-minute detailed breakdown of how you can structure the class using the materials that we've provided. So just to give you an example, for this particular lesson, as all of our lessons begin, they include what's called the do now. So in this case, it would be for time for reviewing homework, as well as categorizing different types of additives into different groups. The next part of the lesson would include the activity. So in our case, the food additive matching game. And then the second main component of the lesson that day would be to participate in a lecture or discussion around the topic of what are some common food additives and their uses. And then finally, all of our lessons include a brief wrap-up at the end of the lesson. So in our case, the wrap-up would focus on these two questions: are additives good or bad? And is the answer to this question the same for all people? All right. So to begin, I want to just sort of briefly start to fill out this table. And I want to turn this over to Peter and Liz and just ask you, what types of food additives can you think of within these 3 different categories: preservatives, nutrients, and hormones?
So I know salts are used to preserve things.
Yeah, exactly. Salt.
I think I've heard of like nitrates, like in bacon or lunch meat.
Nitrates, yep. See a lot of, oftentimes on packaging for hot dogs.
Yeah, the nitrates in hot dogs.
Yeah, and wine, I think, has sulfites, sulfates, maybe?
Yep, exactly. Yep, sulfates. How about nutrients?
Well, I know that they put vitamin D into milk because back in the day, when there were children laborers, they were spending all day inside and not getting enough vitamin D and then getting rickets. Very sad.
Yeah, so definitely a way to address and correct a public health issue. One way to address it, I guess.
And also calcium. They fortify milk with calcium.
Yep, calcium.
Yeah. Or orange juice.
Yep, calcium and orange juice. Good example of fortification there. Any others?
Fiber, I think.
Yep, fiber. Yeah, oftentimes in the processing of different types of foods, you can lose some of that fiber content. So adding it back has sort of been a way to introduce that fiber into people's diets. And how about hormones?
Like female hormones, like estrogen.
Yep, estrogen.
Corticoid.
Example.
I think that's also one.
Yep, corticoids. Yep, so both of these hormones are good examples of ways that can stimulate growth and milk production in livestock. Yep. All right. So here I've just provided a few other examples of food additives or components added to foods that some of your students might have heard of before and may contribute in terms of this discussion. All right, so before we get into the activity, I just want to draw the distinction between different types of additives. So there are actually two categories of additives in our food. Intentional additives, which include preservatives and nutrients. And intentional additives are those that serve a purpose, such as keeping food fresh or enhancing its flavor. So obviously they are intentionally added to the food. And the second category is, of course, unintentional additives. These include hormones, antibiotics, and pesticides. And these are contaminants or other compounds that have somehow found their way into our food despite careful practices in food processing. So with that, I want to move on to doing a round of the food additive matching game, and we are going to be focusing on pesticides and how they get, or potential foods that they could contaminate. So with that, Peter and Liz, I'm going to show you these 9 different pictures of 9 different types of foods. So you guys can go ahead and kind of discuss with yourselves and go ahead and circle which of these foods do you think might contain pesticides?
Well, I know that pesticides are used in crop production to keep like insects and other pests from eating the vegetables before we get to eat them. So I guess all of the things that are crops, like apple, corn, definitely tomato.
Grains like wheats.
Yeah, that's also a crop. Forget about that one. I guess canned tomatoes, because they're just like tomatoes, but in a can. Yeah.
Great. All right. So let's click through the answer. So yes, so here, potentially all of these foods could be contaminated by pesticides. Peter and Liz, do any of these types of foods surprise you?
Yeah, the canned tuna. Well, meats in general, but the canned tuna seems to be really surprising.
Yeah. Yes, so exactly. So in terms of canned tuna, tuna, as you may or may not know, typically tuna is not commercially farmed for food, but rather it's caught where it lives, sort of kind of in the deep sea, in the ocean. So you might be wondering, how could pesticides be making their way all the way to these tuna? And in the last several decades, one of the problems that we've been experiencing is water runoff from farms and agricultural land has been carried into the ocean, where it can be eaten by smaller fish and other like plankton and other animals in the food chain, and eventually can begin to bioaccumulate in tuna. So that's how it could get into our food. And then, of course, in terms of meat, such as beef and chicken, some pesticides are lipid soluble. So when they're sprayed on crops, those crops then become feed for livestock. And when those livestock then eat the pesticides, the fat soluble pesticides can begin to accumulate in the adipose tissue of those animals. And typically it's more of these fat soluble pesticides as opposed to water soluble pesticides, which are easier to flush out of your system and don't typically bioaccumulate as much.
What about milk?
So milk is kind of a similar story. Milk is produced in the mammary glands, which are fatty tissue. So again, if we have fat soluble pesticides, they can accumulate in the tissue and also in the milk, which is a somewhat fatty substance as well. Cool. All right. Well, great. Thank you for participating, you guys. Okay. So the activity that I just showed you comes directly from the high school curriculum. And in our online courses developed specifically for teachers, we have really tried to create really distinct connections between the higher level of content that we're providing in our online courses with the high school activities that come from our curriculum. So I want to show an example of that here. But before I do, I just want to give a brief overview of our course, or an example of one course. So our courses are hosted online in a Canvas platform, and each course contains between 4 and 6 lessons. So as you can see here, here's one lesson, 2, and yeah, this particular course has 4 different lessons, including talking about antibiotics, GMOs, and talking about how our food gets contaminated. So we try to incorporate a lot of interactive activities into our online learning platform. So here I just want to point out 2 of them. So first, we have discussions throughout, kind of peppered throughout our online lessons. And the discussions are places where you as teachers can share tips and tricks for teaching the curriculum with other instructors around the country. So we really hope that these types of discussions can serve as a resource for you and the rest of the teachers in this particular online course community. And then second, we have interactive activities, which I'll show here. So this is sort of this is how I have adapted the high school version of the food additive matching game into an online sort of experience or activity for those taking the online course. So it's sort of a drag and drop activity. So you can drag your answers, and once you submit them, it will check the answers for you and provide some feedback as to whether it's correct or not. And then finally, with activities that come directly from the high school curriculum, we've tried to provide these boxes that sort of call out and directly highlight activities that came directly from the high school curriculum, and try to point out why this topic is so important and how to contextualize it in terms of the higher level content that you're learning within the high school curriculum.